The evening sky carried the kind of quiet glow that seemed painted by unseen hands, a canvas of fading rose and silver stretching endlessly over the town.
Order in the court.
She stood by the river, her reflection rippling across the water like a secret only she could read. To anyone passing by, she might have appeared like an ordinary young woman, lost in thought, clutching the book she never quite managed to finish. Yet in her eyes was a depth that whispered of stories too heavy to be told aloud, secrets bound to her heart the way twilight binds itself to the night. The wind lifted strands of her hair, soft and dark, and with it came the sensation that life was about to shift, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this very moment to turn a hidden page. The first time she saw him, it wasn't in the grand collision people expect of fated encounters. No storm, no dramatic rescue, only the stillness of that riverside evening. He had been sitting on the opposite bank, sketching in a worn notebook, unaware that someone else was watching him with a quiet curiosity. His posture was calm, shoulders relaxed, yet there was a gentleness in the way he leaned over his drawing, as though the act of creating was both a confession and a prayer. She could not hear his thoughts, but she felt them, woven in each careful stroke of pencil against paper. Something within her softened, as though healing had begun before a single word was spoken. The town around them seemed ordinary, but both carried invisible worlds inside. She lived beneath the weight of a family story that was never hers to tell, a truth concealed for the sake of protection. He bore the shadows of a past he tried to bury beneath ink and graphite, letting his sketches speak in the silence where words often betrayed him. Neither of them knew that the universe had drawn invisible threads between them long before their eyes met across the water. That night, however, something stirred, as though the river itself leaned closer to listen. She remembered how his gaze finally lifted, the line of his pencil stilled, and their eyes collided across the distance. It was nothing more than a glance, yet it left her unsettled, as though someone had suddenly looked straight into her heart without permission. There was no smile exchanged, no introduction offered, only that fleeting recognition that lingers when souls meet and cannot pretend otherwise. She left first, clutching her book tighter, but all night her mind replayed the image of him, the quiet boy with the sketchbook, the stranger who had unknowingly trespassed into her hidden thoughts. The next day unfolded like any other, yet the memory of the river stayed with her, warm and persistent, the way certain melodies haunt the mind long after the song has ended. She returned there, though she told herself it was only for the comfort of familiar air. But she knew, deep down, she was hoping. And when she saw him again, sitting on the same bank with his notebook resting against his knees, it was as if destiny had been waiting patiently for her courage. This time she walked closer, letting the sound of her steps on the grass announce her presence. He looked up, startled but not unfriendly. His eyes, a quiet shade of grey, held the calm of someone who had seen storms but learned to listen to the silence afterward. "You're always here," she said softly, surprising even herself with the ease of the words. He tilted his head, offering a small, almost secretive smile. "And now, so are you." The simplicity of his answer made her heart ache with something unfamiliar, something tender, something safe. The healing tone of his voice seemed to wrap around her like a gentle embrace, one she had longed for without knowing it. They sat near each other, first in silence, then in conversation that grew like wildflowers after rain. She learned his name, the way he preferred tea over coffee, how his sketches were more than hobbies, They were maps of memories he didn't know how else to keep. He, in turn, discovered her love for books and the way she carried pain behind her laughter. Their words were clumsy at first, hesitant like children learning a new language, yet every pause felt alive, filled with an unspoken truth that neither dared yet to name. By the third meeting, it no longer felt accidental. The river had become their sanctuary, a place where burdens dissolved into the rhythm of water and secrets softened in the air between them. They began to share fragments of themselves, not the polished stories told to strangers, but the hidden ones. She spoke of nights spent wondering why her world felt divided between duty and desire. He confessed how drawing had once been his lifeline when the world seemed too heavy to bear. Each word was not just spoken, but received, like an offering of trust laid gently into open palms. Love did not announce itself loudly. It grew in the quiet, in the way he lent her his jacket when the wind grew sharp, in the way she brought him warm bread from the bakery simply because she thought of him. Healing came, not in sudden revelations, but in the gradual realization that they had found in each other a home where wounds could breathe without shame. And as the days folded into weeks, the town around them remained the same, but their hearts shifted, weaving a tapestry no one else could see. For those listening now, perhaps you know this feeling, that gentle trembling of the soul when connection arrives unexpectedly. It's the reminder that even in ordinary places extraordinary bonds are born, and maybe, as you hear their story unfold, you'll be reminded of your own hidden rivers, the places where your heart once recognized another without needing explanation. If this journey touches something in you, I invite you to stay with me through it all, to like, to leave a comment, to subscribe. So together we can continue exploring stories that heal, stories that remind us we are never alone in longing for love. The river became not just their meeting place, but the thread that stitched them towards something larger than themselves. And though neither yet understood where this path would lead, they both knew one truth with quiet certainty. Life had shifted. Love, fragile yet powerful, had stepped into their lives, and nothing would ever be the same again. The story did not end there. It was only beginning, moving softly, inevitably, toward the next chapter that would test the strength of what their hearts had found. The days slipped quietly into one another, carrying with them a rhythm that neither of them had expected to crave so deeply. The river, once only a backdrop of solitude, became a living witness to their unfolding bond. She began to arrive with the sun still low, her footsteps finding familiar paths through the morning grass, while he was already there, sketchbook open, his pencil resting against the page as though it had been waiting for her presence before moving again. He would look up, and the silence between them would bloom into something warm and steady, the kind of silence that healed rather than pressed upon the heart. Their conversations were gentle at first, shaped by the innocence of discovery. She told him about the stories she carried inside her, how words had always been her refuge, how pages filled with ink could soothe wounds the world did not see. He listened in a way few ever had, not to respond, but to truly hear. In return, he revealed the quiet world behind his drawings, portraits of fleeting moments, landscapes painted from memory, sketches of faces he had loved and lost. With each admission, their connection deepened, forming invisible roots beneath the soil of ordinary hours. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, They sat side by side, the river whispering its endless lullaby, while birds moved across the sky in slow arcs. Those silences were not empty. They were filled with the presence of being understood without explanation. Healing resided in those pauses, in the quiet assurance that no performance was required, no mask necessary. For her, it was the first time she felt seen without the weight of questions she could never fully answer. For him, it was the rare comfort of knowing he did not have to hide his scars behind smiles. She began to notice the details of him, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly before it found steadiness in a drawing, the way his gaze softened when the light touched the water, the quiet laughter that escaped when she teased him about his stubbornness. He, too, memorized her subtleties, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, the way her voice lowered when speaking of things that mattered, the way her eyes glistened when silence carried more truth than words. These were the fragments that stitched themselves into memory, binding them in ways neither dared to name yet. One afternoon, rain threatened the horizon. Clouds gathered heavy and dark, and still she came. He had been waiting beneath the shelter of an old willow, his sketchbook closed this time, as though the storm had commanded reverence. She joined him without hesitation, the drizzle soon drumming softly against leaves above them. They spoke of nothing in particular, but when the rain thickened and the world blurred beyond the curtain of water, he held out his jacket, draping it around her shoulders. She smiled, warmth blooming despite the chill, and whispered a thank you that carried more weight than the word itself. In that moment, she felt a thread of trust weave itself stronger, a thread spun not by grand gestures, but by the tenderness of being cared for. Time outside their sanctuary carried on. Families, obligations, the noise of ordinary life. Yet each time they returned to the river, it was as though the rest of the world dissolved, leaving only the two of them and the quiet miracle of their bond. She began bringing small things for him, a loaf of bread from the bakery, a bookmark she had made with pressed flowers, a poem copied in her careful handwriting. He began sketching not just the river or distant hills, but her. The curve of her profile, the tilt of her head when she read, the serenity that spread across her features when she closed her eyes and listened to the water. She protested at first, embarrassed, but when she saw herself through his art, she realized he had captured not just her likeness, but the essence of who she was becoming beside him, softer, braver, more alive. As days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew stronger, shaped by countless small gestures. She learned how he carried grief for someone he had lost long ago, a shadow that lingered in his silence. He learned how she bore the weight of secrets, truths she could not share without tearing open wounds she had sworn to protect. Yet neither pulled away. Instead, they leaned closer, their vulnerabilities becoming bridges rather than barriers. In each confession, in each trembling word, healing unfolded like a quiet dawn. There were moments when laughter filled the air, breaking through their usual calm. He once tried reading aloud from her book, stumbling over words with exaggerated dramatics, making her laugh until tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes. She teased him about his serious sketches, insisting he draw something playful, and he surprised her with a silly caricature of them both, holding hands beneath a sky full of crooked stars. These playful interludes wove joy into their connection, proof that love is not only about carrying sorrow together, but also about creating lightness strong enough to scatter shadows. One evening, as the sunset bled gold into the water, she found herself confessing a dream she had never spoken aloud. She told him she longed for a love that felt like home, one that did not demand perfection, but offered peace. Her voice wavered, unsure of revealing so much. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, his touch steady and sure, and simply held it as the sky deepened into twilight. That gesture became his answer. Unspoken, yet powerful. The promise of safety, the assurance that her longing was not foolish but sacred. In the stillness of those days, a foundation was being laid. Love was not declared with dramatic proclamations, but built quietly, stone by stone, in the ordinary moments they shared. The healing presence of their bond reached places within them they had never dared to touch alone. They began to move as though attuned to one another, finishing thoughts, anticipating needs, recognizing unspoken fears. Each step forward felt natural, inevitable, like the unfolding of a story written long before they arrived at its pages. Beyond the river, the world held trials neither of them could escape, but within their sanctuary they found strength. The bond between them had not yet been tested by storms too fierce to ignore, yet even in its tenderness it carried resilience. For what they had discovered was not a fleeting infatuation, but the beginning of something rooted, something that promised to grow even when the winds of life threatened to bend it. And so, as another evening settled and the stars blinked awake in the velvet sky, they lingered by the water, their shoulders brushing, their breaths sinking in quiet harmony. Neither spoke of the future, yet both knew the present had already carved a path forward. The story of their love was no longer a question of possibility, but of endurance, whether what they were building in the quiet would hold steady when the louder trials of life came knocking. The river carried their reflections into the night, as if promising to remember what even they were afraid to name. And with that, their hearts moved gently toward the next chapter, where secrets and truths would collide, and the strength of their bond would be tested in ways neither yet imagined. The quiet rhythm of their days had grown so natural that she almost forgot what life had felt like before him. Every step toward the river seemed guided by something larger than chance. Every glance at his sketchbook was another thread tying her soul to his. Yet beneath the warmth they shared, unspoken truths lingered, like stones buried beneath clear water, visible yet untouched. It was in the way her laughter sometimes faltered mid-sound, as though caught by a memory she could not reveal. It was in the way his gaze would darken when she asked too much about his past, his pencil moving faster on the page to avoid words that might expose him. Their bond grew, but so did the quiet gravity of what they both carried inside. She had always lived with secrets. From childhood, her world was divided into what she could say and what she could never breathe aloud. It had taught her discipline, but it had also taught her silence. Even with him, the boy whose presence felt like a gentle healing balm, she hesitated to share the truths that weighed on her heart. Sometimes, late at night, she wondered if keeping them hidden was a form of betrayal, even if it was the only way she knew to survive. She imagined the moment he might look at her differently, not with warmth, but with doubt, and the thought terrified her more than loneliness ever had. He, too, carried shadows. And she saw it in his drawings, sketches of empty rooms, of faceless figures, of hands reaching for something they could not hold. He spoke of them only in fragments, letting slip pieces of sorrow disguised as casual remarks. A lost brother, a friendship broken by betrayal, a dream abandoned when the weight of grief became too heavy. He never said it all at once, but she pieced together enough to know that pain had shaped him as surely as love had softened him. And in those moments she longed to tell him her own truths, to confess the things she had never dared to give voice. Their closeness made silence both easier and harder. Easier because they could sit together without demanding explanations. Harder because the longer they remained, the more the need for honesty pressed between them like an unseen wall. It began with small hesitations. She would turn away when he asked about her family. He would change the subject when she wondered about the scars on his hand. Each evasion was tenderly given, but it left behind an ache neither of them spoke of. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the first stars shimmered above the river, he finally asked her something she could not easily avoid. "Why do your eyes always change when someone mentions your mother?" His voice was soft, not demanding, but filled with the kind of care that made her heart tremble. She froze, every instinct urging her to retreat into practiced silence. Instead, she smiled faintly and said, "Some stories are too heavy for the night to hold." It was the gentlest refusal she could offer, yet she saw how his shoulders tightened, how disappointment flickered before he smoothed it away. That moment lingered between them, a fracture barely visible, but present all the same. And though he did not press her again, she felt it each time he looked at her, as though he was waiting for her to trust him fully. The river that had once been pure sanctuary began to feel like a mirror of their hearts. Beautiful, but holding reflections of truths left unspoken. The world beyond them intruded more often now. Friends began to ask questions about where she spent her afternoons. His family wondered why he returned home with sketches, filled not just with landscapes, but with a girl they had never met. Whispers of curiosity circled them, and though they ignored them, the pressure of being seen by others forced their bond into sharper relief. Love that had felt private was becoming something that demanded courage. Still, tenderness remained. He continued to draw her, capturing her as if afraid she might disappear. She continued to bring him pieces of her world, a poem folded in her pocket, a ribbon she tied around his sketchbook, a melody she hummed when she thought no one listened. Each gesture was a promise that even if words failed, her heart spoke clearly. Yet she knew promises without truth could one day break, and that fear gnawed quietly at her whenever their laughter faded into silence. One afternoon, a storm rolled in quickly, the sky darkening with a violence neither had expected. They ran together, finding shelter beneath the willow tree, breathless and soaked from the sudden downpour. Their laughter echoed in the storm, bright and alive. But when it faded, something heavier settled. She looked at him, water dripping from her hair, and whispered, "I wish I could tell you everything." His hand reached for hers, steady, patient. "You don't have to yet," he said. "But I hope one day you will." That single sentence both comforted and unsettled her. It gave her space, but it also reminded her of the truth waiting like a tide that could not be held back forever. From that day, she felt the pull of choice growing stronger. To remain silent and risk the fracture widening, or to reveal the truths she had buried and risk shattering the fragile peace they had built. Nights found her awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the look in his eyes if he knew everything. Would it break the healing warmth between them, or would it deepen it? The answer was a weight she could not yet carry, but she knew the time was coming when she would have no choice. For him, too, the struggle grew. He had begun to trust her with more of his pain, sharing the story of the friend he had once called brother, the betrayal that had left scars deeper than flesh. She listened with tears in her eyes, holding his hand as he spoke, whispering words that soothed the ache, even if they could not undo the past. And each time, guilt pricked her heart, because while he bared his wounds, she still kept hers hidden. Love continued to grow between them, tender and fierce, but love without truth is always tested. Their bond was no longer just a gentle sanctuary. It had become a place where the weight of secrets pressed harder with every heartbeat. Yet even amid the tension, there was beauty. They found healing in small things, in the warmth of shared bread, in the comfort of sitting close when words failed, in the trust of hands entwined, even when silence reigned. The river, constant and eternal, seemed to whisper of what was coming. Its flow reminded them that time does not pause, that secrets carried too long will one day surface. And as the seasons shifted, as leaves turned gold and fell into the water, both of them knew, without speaking, that their love was heading toward a moment where silence would no longer be enough. The tenderness of what they had built was real, yet fragile. And as another evening closed around them, her head resting against his shoulder, she wondered if love could truly heal when truth still lay hidden in the shadows. She did not know the answer yet, but she knew the question itself was already shaping their story, carrying them toward a turning point they could not avoid. And so, beneath the twilight sky, with the river carrying their reflections into the night, their hearts beat in rhythm with both love and fear, longing for the day when the walls between them would finally fall. That day was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the weight of his gaze, in the ache of her own silence. And when it came, nothing between them would ever be the same again. The air between them had grown heavier with every passing day, not because love had diminished, but because the truths they had avoided now pressed harder against the fragile walls of their silence. What once felt like a sanctuary began to tremble under the weight of unspoken fears, and with it came the shadows of doubt. Small misunderstandings crept in, like cracks invisible at first, widening slowly until they could no longer be ignored. It was not anger that separated them, but the ache of feeling distance where closeness used to flow effortlessly. She noticed it first in his eyes, the way they lingered on her when she avoided answering a question, the flicker of disappointment he tried to disguise as patience. He noticed it in her laughter, softer now, strained at the edges as though joy was being guarded rather than freely given. They both loved deeply, yet love without honesty became a fragile flame, flickering against the winds of mistrust. One evening, as autumn pressed its chill into the air, they sat beneath the willow tree where so many of their tender moments had blossomed. The river moved as it always had, steady and healing, but even its constancy could not erase the storm rising quietly between them. He closed his sketchbook without drawing, his fingers tightening around the pencil until it nearly broke. She watched him, her heart trembling, waiting for words she knew were coming. "Why do you keep hiding parts of yourself from me?" His voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of every unasked question, every hesitation left unspoken. She looked down at her hands, her throat tightening, her silence louder than any confession. "I tell you about my scars, my grief," he continued, softer now, as though afraid of breaking what remained between them. "But you keep your pain locked away. Don't you trust me enough to let me in?" Her chest ached with the tenderness of his plea. She wanted to tell him everything, to bear the truths she had carried like stones against her ribs. But fear held her still, the fear of being misunderstood, of losing the healing presence he had become. "It's not about trust," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "It's about survival. Some truths, once spoken, they change everything." He turned away, looking out at the water, his jaw tight. "Then maybe I've been wrong to believe love can live in half-light." The words were not cruel, but they cut with the precision of truth. She reached for him, her hand hovering before touching his sleeve. Yet he did not turn back. The silence that followed was not the comforting stillness they once shared. It was a canyon stretching wide, filled with everything they had not dared to say. The days that followed were quieter, marked by hesitation rather than ease. They still met by the river, still sat beneath the willow, but their words were fewer, their smiles thinner. Each carried the same longing, the same desperate hope that the bond they had built was strong enough to withstand the shadows pressing against it. Yet both also carried the gnawing question: could love truly survive when honesty was withheld? Whispers from the outside world deepened the tension. A rumor reached him from a friend who claimed to know fragments of her family's story, painting it in tones of scandal and deception. He did not want to believe it, yet the seed of doubt lodged itself within him, fed by her silences. She noticed his distance growing, the way his eyes searched hers with questions he no longer asked aloud. Her heart broke quietly each time, for she recognized that her silence was wounding him, even as it tried to protect what they had. One night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, their fragile bond cracked. They had been sitting close, her head resting against his shoulder, when he spoke words she had feared for weeks. "I can't keep loving shadows," he whispered, his voice raw. She pulled back, her eyes wide, her breath sharp as though she had been struck. He looked at her with all the love he still carried, but also with exhaustion. "I need to know you. Not the fragments, not the guarded pieces. You, or else." He did not finish the sentence, but the space it left was enough. Her tears came silently, slipping down her cheeks without sound. She wanted to scream the truths she had swallowed for so long, to tell him everything, to beg him to understand. But fear bound her lips, and she said only, "I'm sorry." He closed his eyes, as though the apology itself was confirmation of his worst fears. When he stood to leave, the night seemed to swallow him whole, and the river, once a place of healing, echoed with the ache of absence. The days that followed were filled with absence more than presence. He did not come to the river, and though she went, hoping, the willow tree remained a silent witness to her solitude. She carried his absence like a wound, her heart aching with every memory of laughter, every sketch he had left unfinished. The healing warmth that once surrounded her had turned to a cold emptiness, reminding her with each breath of what she risked losing forever. For him, the distance was no less painful. He filled his days with sketches, but each one returned to her face, her eyes, the way she had looked at him when she whispered apologies instead of truths. He wanted to return, to forgive, to wait, but a voice within him whispered that love should not require such silence, that he deserved honesty as much as he offered it. Yet even in their separation, love lingered. She carried his jacket, still faint with the scent of rain, wrapping it around her shoulders when nights grew cold. He carried the ribbon she had tied around his sketchbook, fingering it absent-mindedly as though it tethered him to her still. Their love was not gone. It was simply caught in the storm of misunderstanding, waiting for the courage that would bring it back into the light. When they finally met again, it was not planned. She was walking through the marketplace, her basket light in her hands, when she saw him across the square. His eyes met hers, and the world seemed to still for a moment, the noise of vendors and laughter falling silent. Neither moved at first, bound by the weight of what had passed between them. Then, slowly, he took a step toward her. Their reunion was not filled with dramatic words or sudden forgiveness. It was quieter than that, marked by the trembling of her lips as she whispered his name, by the softness of his gaze as he reached for her hand. The warmth of his touch reminded her of everything they had built, everything worth fighting for. And in that moment, she realized that love could not survive on silence any longer. "I need to tell you the truth," she said, her voice shaking but firm. His eyes searched hers, filled with both fear and hope. The moment stretched, fragile and tender, the air around them charged with the weight of what was about to be revealed. She took a deep breath, feeling the healing presence of his hand steadying hers, and knew that whatever came next would change them forever. The storm of misunderstanding had led them here, to the fragile edge where silence could no longer shield them. And though fear still whispered at the corners of her heart, love spoke louder, urging her forward into the next chapter, where truth, at last, would find its voice. The night she finally chose to speak felt different from all the others. The air was cool and fragrant with autumn leaves, the kind of evening that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. They walked together by the river again, side by side, but with a careful space between them, as though each was afraid to press too close before words bridged the distance. The moon cast silver threads across the water, weaving light into the darkness, and she thought it fitting. Truth, too, was light, though sometimes blinding before it became gentle. She stopped walking first, her heart racing, her hands trembling against the folds of her coat. He turned to face her, his expression calm but waiting, like someone who had carried both hope and hurt too long. She searched his eyes, gathering the courage she had lacked for so long, and then the words spilled, raw and unpolished, like water breaking through a dam. She told him about her family, about the silence she had been raised to keep, about the lies that had been painted as protection. She spoke of her mother's absence, of the secrets that had weighed down her childhood, of the moments she had longed for ordinary simplicity but found only shadows. Her voice broke at times, but she continued because stopping would mean returning to silence, and silence had already cost them too much. He did not interrupt. He stood steady, his gaze fixed on her, his breath even, his hands at his sides trembling slightly, though he did not lift them yet. When her confession faltered, when tears blurred her vision, he finally stepped closer, his fingers brushing hers with a touch so gentle it was almost healing in itself. "I wanted to know you," he said softly. "Not the polished pieces, not the fragments you thought were safe to show. You. This is you." His words struck her heart with warmth, and though her tears fell freely now, they carried release rather than shame. The truth was heavy, but once spoken, it began to feel lighter. It filled the space between them, not with fear, but with honesty, raw and fragile, yet real. She realized then that love could not grow fully in shadows. It needed the light of truth to bloom. And he, standing there with steady patience, became the living proof of love's ability to hold what once felt unholdable. For him, hearing her confession was like watching a door open to a room he had always sensed but never seen. The weight of her silence, the hesitations in her laughter, the guarded look in her eyes, all of it made sense now. He felt no anger, only tenderness, because in her courage he recognized his own struggles mirrored back. He knew what it was to carry grief unspoken, to let silence shape identity, to fear rejection more than loneliness. And so he did what his heart had longed to do. He pulled her into his arms, not to erase her words, but to honor them, to promise with his embrace that love would not vanish simply because truth had arrived. In that moment, healing began. It was not sudden or complete, but it flowed through them like the river beside them, steady, quiet, unending. She rested against him, her tears dampening his shoulder, and for the first time she felt entirely known. He whispered nothing extravagant, only the steady rhythm of reassurance. "I'm here. I'm not leaving. We face this together." And though the words were simple, they carried a power greater than anything she had imagined. Their bond deepened in the days that followed. Honesty became a thread woven gently into their moments, fragile at times, but resilient. She no longer felt the need to hide every silence, and he no longer felt the ache of being shut out. They spoke more openly, of fears and dreams alike, discovering that love was not about perfection, but about choosing to stay even when the truths were heavy. Of course, not every moment was smooth. There were times when shadows of doubt returned, when the weight of the past pressed hard against her heart, when his own scars resurfaced with unexpected sharpness. But instead of retreating, they leaned toward each other. He would place his hand over hers, grounding her when memories threatened to overwhelm. She would read softly to him when grief pulled him back to the friend he had lost, her voice becoming a balm against sorrow. Together they learned that love was not the absence of wounds, but the decision to keep healing, hand in hand. The town, curious as ever, noticed their closeness. Whispers grew louder, and some looked with suspicion, while others with quiet admiration. Yet neither cared as they once might have. Their love had grown past the fear of being misunderstood. It was rooted now in something greater than appearances. On nights when the world outside felt too harsh, they found refuge again by the willow, the river carrying away their words, their laughter, their silence. One evening, as winter's breath began to touch the air, he brought her a sketch unlike the others. It was not of landscapes or faceless figures, but of her, seated beneath the willow, eyes lifted toward the stars, her expression both strong and tender. Across the bottom he had written only one line: "The truth is beautiful." She pressed the paper to her heart, tears filling her eyes again. But these tears felt different. They were not born of sorrow, but of gratitude, the healing gratitude of being loved fully, without condition. From then on, their story carried a different light. Misunderstanding had given way to revelation, and revelation had led them deeper into one another's hearts. They knew challenges still waited ahead, No love was free from trials, but they also knew the strength they had found together could endure. For when truth had finally been spoken, love had not broken. It had grown. And as the river moved on, eternal and steady, so too did their bond, ready to face whatever lay ahead. And so their days moved forward, tender and true, toward the next chapter, where reconciliation would no longer be a fragile hope, but a living reality, shaping their future in ways they had once been too afraid to imagine. The days that followed their moment of truth unfolded with a tenderness neither of them had known before. Where silence once weighed heavily between them, openness now flowed like a river breaking free of its ice. Conversations became easier, not because the pain had vanished, but because it was no longer hidden. They shared stories in fragments, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with tears, and each confession became a stitch, binding their wounded places into something whole. She found herself watching him more closely, not with suspicion, but with wonder. The way his eyes softened when she spoke of her fears, the way he listened without judgment, the way his presence steadied her like the earth itself, all of it reminded her that love could be both fragile and unshakable. Healing had taken root, not in the absence of hurt, but in the presence of trust, and trust, once planted, grew quickly when nurtured with honesty. He, too, felt the difference. The girl he had once seen as mysterious and untouchable had revealed herself fully, and in doing so had become even more precious to him. And there was no longer the ache of being kept outside her world. He had been invited in, shown the scars, the broken pieces, the quiet hopes she feared to name. And in her vulnerability he found not weakness but strength, the kind of strength that drew him closer, compelled him to hold her as though the act itself could shield her from every storm yet to come. Their reconciliation was not dramatic. It was gentle, like dawn after a long night. The river once again became their sanctuary, but this time its whispers carried not unspoken doubts, but promises. They sat together beneath the willow tree, hands entwined, speaking softly of small things, the taste of bread, the scent of rain, the shape of dreams for a future neither had dared to imagine before. Love was no longer a question, but an answer, steady and clear. Sometimes, when the world outside pressed hard with gossip or suspicion, she faltered, her heart tightening with fear that others would never understand. On those days, he would draw her close, his hand resting against her back, and remind her with simple words that they did not need the world's approval. "We are enough," he whispered once, and the healing energy of that truth filled her like sunlight after rain. She began to believe it, slowly at first, then with a faith that transformed her very breathing. They created rituals of tenderness. She would bring him stories to read beneath the willow, her voice weaving words that carried both sorrow and hope. He would sketch her while she spoke, capturing not just her face, but the light that seemed to surround her when she allowed herself to be free. On colder nights, they would share a blanket, her head resting against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat as though it were the most trustworthy sound in the world. These small gestures became anchors, grounding them when memories threatened to pull them back into shadows. One evening, as winter wrapped the town in quiet, he surprised her with a lantern. They carried it together to the riverbank, setting it afloat on the water's surface. The light drifted slowly away, casting golden ripples across the dark. She asked him what it meant, and he smiled, brushing his thumb against her cheek. "It means letting go," he said, of pain, of fear, of everything that tried to keep us apart. We send it away, and we hold on to what remains. She leaned into him, her tears gentle this time, and whispered that she had never known love could feel so much like healing. In the stillness of those days, they also began to dream aloud. She spoke of the life she wanted, not one of grandeur, but one of peace. A small home, shelves of books, a garden where healing herbs could grow. He spoke of an art studio filled with light, where he could paint not just shadows, but colors born of joy. Their dreams, once kept private for fear of disappointment, began to merge into a shared vision, each hope folding into the other like threads woven into a single cloth. Yet reconciliation was not just about words and dreams. It was about action, about proving through presence that love was steady. When she fell ill one morning with fever, he was there with warm broth, with quiet hands pressing cool cloths to her forehead, with sketches drawn in silence to make her smile when she awoke. When his grief resurfaced on the anniversary of his friend's passing, she held him through the night, her arms becoming the refuge he had never known he needed. These moments became proof that their bond was not fragile, but resilient, built not only on passion, but on devotion. The town continued to whisper, as towns often do, but whispers could no longer pierce them. Together they walked through markets, attended gatherings, their closeness evident in every shared glance, every casual touch. Some judged, some envied, some admired, but none of it mattered. They had chosen each other, and that choice carried more weight than any opinion outside their love. As spring returned, so did color and bloom. The willow unfurled new leaves, the river ran brighter, and their love deepened into something both ordinary and extraordinary. She often thought of how close they had come to breaking apart, how silence had nearly destroyed them. And now, in the warmth of his presence, she understood that love is not about never faltering, but about choosing, again and again, to return, to forgive, to heal. On one of those luminous mornings, he looked at her with a gaze that seemed to see not only who she was, but who she was becoming. "You are my home," he said simply, and though the words were few, they held the weight of a vow. She smiled, her heart swelling with the quiet joy of recognition, and replied, "And you are my peace." In that exchange, they sealed something greater than promises. They sealed a truth that would carry them into every chapter yet unwritten. The reconciliation that had begun in trembling confession had now grown into certainty. Their love, tested and proven, was ready to face not only their present, but their future. And as the days stretched before them, bathed in both light and shadow, they stepped forward together, knowing that whatever storms might come, their bond would not only endure, but bloom stronger still. And so, hand in hand, they walked on, their hearts aligned not just by passion, but by trust, their souls carrying the healing truth that love, once freed from silence, becomes unbreakable. Ahead of them lay a new horizon, one filled not with fear, but with the quiet promise of forever. Spring ripened into summer, and with it their love unfolded into a season of fullness. And the air grew softer, the evenings stretched longer, and the world around them seemed to bloom in rhythm with the bond they now carried so openly. Their days were threaded with simple joys, walking through meadows dotted with wildflowers, pausing to share bread beneath the willow, or wandering through town side by side as though they had never been strangers at all. What once had been shadowed by secrecy was now illuminated by presence, and both of them felt it in their very bones. They were no longer surviving love, they were living it. She found healing in the way he looked at her without expectation, as though nothing about her needed to be fixed or hidden. He found healing in her laughter, now free and unguarded, no longer weighed down by fear. They began to weave routines that felt like rituals, morning walks where the sun spilled gold across the river, evenings when he read aloud from her favorite stories while she leaned against him, listening less to the words than to the warmth in his voice. Their lives were not grand, but in their simplicity lay a beauty that neither had dared to imagine before. Sometimes they spoke of their future with the quiet awe of people who had once believed such dreams were impossible. She dreamed of a home filled with books and music, where children's voices might one day echo. He dreamed of a studio, walls washed in light, where his sketches could bloom into paintings filled not with sorrow but with joy. They began to imagine these futures not separately but together, building a vision of life that carried both of their longings in harmony. And each time they spoke, they felt the world grow wider with possibility. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and rose, he surprised her with a question that made her heart race. "What would it mean to you," he asked softly, "if love were not only here and now, but always? If we bound it, not with words we might forget, but with a vow that even storms cannot undo?" She looked at him, her breath catching, and in his eyes she saw not only longing but certainty. She understood then that love had carried them past doubt, past silence, into something so steady it could hold the weight of forever. Her answer was not a speech, but a single nod, her hand finding his, fingers lacing tight, a promise spoken without sound. From that night, their intimacy deepened, not only in touch, though their hands often sought each other, but in the way they carried themselves together, each decision, each small step now shaped by the awareness that they were no longer two, but one. She noticed it in the way he paused before speaking, as though considering her thoughts as part of his own. He noticed it in the way she reached for him instinctively when joy or sorrow struck, as though his presence was her first language. Theirs was no longer a tentative bond. It was a union, a healing circle that held them both. Of course, the world did not stop testing them. Whispers of doubt rose again from those who watched with envy or misunderstanding. Old pains resurfaced when memories caught them unaware. Yet they discovered that reconciliation had given them tools, patience, honesty, tenderness, that now served as armor. When fear crept into her, he answered not with frustration, but with steady presence. When grief pulled at him, she answered with soft words and touch, reminding him that no shadow could undo the light they carried together. Their love became a refuge not only for themselves, but for those around them. Friends noticed the change in their faces, the gentleness, the quiet joy, and drew comfort from it. Neighbors who once gossiped now spoke of them with softened tones, recognizing that what had endured such storms must be something real. She often wondered if love could ripple outward like water, touching lives beyond their own. He told her it could, and that perhaps their story was not only for them, but for anyone who needed to believe in healing after brokenness. On Midsummer's Eve, they returned to the river where it had all begun. The air was warm, carrying the hum of crickets and the scent of wild grass. Beneath the willow, he took her hands in his eyes shining with a mixture of tenderness and gravity. "This tree has seen us in silence, in pain, in confession, and in joy," he said. "Let it also witness this, my vow. I choose you, not just for now, not only for easy days, but for every moment we have yet to face. I will not turn from your shadows, and I will not let go of your light." Her eyes filled, and when she answered, her voice was steady, though her heart trembled with love. "I choose you too. I choose the way you hold my truth, the way you see me whole. I choose your sorrow as much as your joy, your silence as much as your laughter. I choose to heal with you, again and again, for as long as breath is ours." The vows, though simple, carried the weight of every step they had walked, and when they sealed them with a kiss beneath the bending branches, it felt as though the river itself blessed them with its endless song. From that night, everything shifted subtly yet completely. Their love was no longer something that might falter. It had been spoken, claimed, sealed in the presence of earth and sky. And as they walked back through the summer fields, fireflies lighting their path, they knew they were not simply holding each other. They were holding a life, shared and sacred, carrying them into whatever lay ahead. And so, with vows echoing softly in their hearts, they stepped forward into the promise of tomorrow, ready for the grand gesture that would one day show the world what they had already shown each other. That love, born of shadows and silence, could rise into light and endure. The summer that had bound their promises slowly gave way to autumn, and with it came a new depth to their love. It was no longer the fragile tenderness of discovery, nor the uncertain trembling of reconciliation. It had become something steady, something woven into every breath of their days. They carried their bond not as something separate from life, but as the very fabric of it. She woke each morning to the comfort of knowing he would be there, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet ways he lived beside her. He, in turn, found himself stronger, softer, more whole, simply because her presence reminded him daily that love was not a dream. It was a healing reality he could touch. They began to build their life with intention. What had once been only whispered dreams grew into tangible beginnings. He found a space for his art, a sunlit corner of an old house where the windows opened wide to fields of gold. She filled their home with books, shelves bending under the weight of stories, each one a reminder of her childhood sanctuary, now reborn into joy. Their evenings became rituals, bread warming in the oven, tea steeping with gentle fragrance, her voice reading aloud while he sketched her form in charcoal and paint. They laughed often, not the laughter that hides wounds, but the kind that springs from wholeness, from knowing they had survived storms and found healing in one another's arms. When autumn winds stirred memories of darker days, they did not retreat as they once might have. Instead, they leaned closer. She would sit beside him when grief returned in sudden waves, holding his hand until his breathing steadied. He would draw her into his arms when her own past pressed too sharply, whispering truths that reminded her she was no longer alone. Love had taught them that healing was not a single moment, but a choice renewed each day, a promise to stand together even when shadows reappeared. Their love became a source of quiet inspiration. Friends who once doubted now came to them for advice, marveling at the peace that seemed to follow them. Neighbors who once whispered with suspicion now spoke of them with softened voices, acknowledging that what had endured so many trials must be real, and they, in turn, gave freely, sharing not just their story, but their presence, listening to others with the same patience and tenderness they had learned to give each other. Healing was no longer just for themselves. It had become something they carried outward, like light spilling from open windows. One evening, as winter approached, he led her back to the willow tree, where so much of their story had been written. Beneath its branches he had placed small lanterns, their glow shimmering against the river. She gasped softly at the sight, her heart swelling with the memory of every moment this tree had witnessed: silence, pain, confession, laughter, vows. He took her hands and whispered, "This is not just where our love began. This is where it continues, stronger than every shadow, brighter than every fear." She pressed her forehead to his, whispering back, "With you, I have learned that truth and love are the same language, and I will speak it with you for the rest of my life." Their kiss beneath the glowing lanterns sealed the truth. Their love was no longer a fragile flame, but a fire that would never die. The seasons turned, but their bond only deepened. They faced each day with gentleness, holding on to the healing they had cultivated. They no longer feared the world's whispers or the weight of secrets. Instead, they lived openly, faithfully, as though each step was both a prayer and an answer. And in time, they discovered that love, once tested and proven, becomes not just a feeling, but a foundation strong enough to build a lifetime upon. Their story was not perfect, nor was it meant to be, but it was true, and in its truth lay a beauty far greater than perfection. They had chosen each other again and again, through shadows and storms, through silence and confession, through brokenness and healing, and that choice, repeated with every sunrise, became the melody of their life. Perhaps, in hearing their journey, you feel a reflection of your own heart, the longing for love that heals, the hope for trust that endures, the desire for a bond that is both tender and unbreakable. If their story has touched you, I invite you to hold on to its message. Love is not about never breaking, but about always choosing to mend together. And if you find comfort in this tale, I welcome you to like this video, to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and to subscribe for more stories that bring light, warmth, and healing to the soul. Your presence here is part of this journey, and together we continue to weave stories of love that endure